A gunshot cracked across Mackinac Island, hard enough to stop conversations in mid-sentence. Anyone who heard it would pause. On June 6th of 1822, traders, voyagers, laborers, and soldiers near the American Fur Company post turned toward the sound, expecting trouble, maybe a drunken fight or an accident involving black powder. Instead, they found a young Canadian voyager named Alexis St Martin, folded over in agony with most of his shirt torn apart and blood absolutely pouring down his side. Somebody had discharged a musket at close range. If you know anything about muskets, they are brutal. The blast hit him directly in the stomach. Men who saw the wound later described it in ways that made other people really quite uncomfortable. Flesh had been ripped away, ribs were broken, pieces of muscle were hanging loose. Food and muscle and stomach contents were spilling from the opening. I don't want to get too graphic here, so I won't go any further than this. But this is the sort of injury that usually ended up with a priest being called and a coffin getting measured for the man. Even today, that's probably what people would instantly think. Most people assumed Alexis would die before morning. And honestly, that was not an unreasonable assumption. The frontier definitely could be brutal and unforgiving. A simple infection could kill a healthy man. Remember, this is long before the days of penicillin. A deep cut from an axe could turn deadly. Medical knowledge still had enormous blind spots, especially in isolated places where surgeons worked with limited supplies and really quite rough and very primitive conditions. But there happened to be an army surgeon stationed nearby. His name was William Beaumont. Now, Beaumont was not some wild-eyed backwoods butcher waving bloody saws around just for fun and trying to scare people. He was not Ed Gein. He was educated and calm and observant. He was a former military surgeon from the War of 1812 who had built a reputation for being capable under pressure. Even so, when he first examined Alexis, he fully expected the man to die. He was in terrible condition. Years later, Beaumont would describe the wound in medical detail, but even his professional language could not hide how catastrophic this wound really was. The musket blast had torn a hole straight through his side and into his stomach itself. Pieces of rib, of course, as I mentioned, were broken. They were shattered. Muscle had been blasted apart, and somehow Alexis kept breathing. Beaumont cleaned the wound as best he could with what he had available at the time. He bled the patient because medicine at the time still clung stubbornly to some of the older practices, and bleeding somebody meant allowing out the blood because they thought it was bad blood. They thought that's where the infection would live. He administered purgatives and treatments that today would probably make modern doctors stare silently at a wall for a few minutes and wonder what the heck were they thinking. And then everybody just sat around and waited. The first few days, of course, were terrible. For more than 2 weeks, nearly everything Alexis swallowed leaked right back out through that really nasty hole in his stomach. Soup would dribble from his wound like it would dribble from a sick person's mouth. Water escaped from the opening. Bits of partially digested food would slide out onto the bandages. This was really, really gross. Imagine trying to recover while your own dinner keeps attempting to escape from you. Talk about on top of spaghetti, all covered in cheese. I lost my poor meatball when somebody sneezed. This guy lived it. And still the man refused to die. Little by little, the fever eased. His strength returned. The bleeding slowed. The stomach began functioning again. This was not what anybody expected. Alexis recovered enough to walk, eventually to talk, and then eventually to work again. But the wound never really fully closed, which is kind of scary. That was the moment this story stopped being merely tragic and started being something really strange. and something that was historically significant, because the edges of Alexis's stomach healed directly into the skin around the opening in his side. The injury formed what doctors call a gastric fistula. So in simple terms, there was now a permanent opening straight into his stomach, like you could put a chopstick in there, or let's say a pencil. There was a literal window into this man's human digestive system. Most people probably would have looked at that situation and completely thanked God the poor man even survived, but William Beaumont looked at it and saw scientific opportunity. Of course he did. You have to remember the time period to understand why this mattered so much. In the early 1800s, digestion was really quite poorly understood. Many theories sounded more like educated guesses than any kind of settled science. Some believed digestion worked mainly through grinding and crushing inside of the stomach, like how a chicken's gizzard would grind and crush things. Others suspected chemical reactions played a larger role, but really nobody had proven anything much. And suddenly, Beaumont possessed something that medical science had pretty much never seen before. It was a living human stomach he could directly observe while it's working right in front of him. It was the sort of opportunity that could make a curious doctor forget pretty much everything else, including his family. At first, Beaumont simply just observed the wound carefully, but then the experiments began. He tried bits of food to strings and lowered them directly into Alexis's stomach through the stomach opening. This sounds really gross. After several hours, he would pull the food back out by the string and inspect how much digestion had occurred. He tried it with bread first, and then with vegetables, and then with meat. And he couldn't tie this to a string, but he did eventually try this with milk also. Different foods digested at different speeds. Interesting, he thought. Some broke down quickly while others lingered stubbornly inside the stomach, especially red meat. There's something profoundly unsettling about imagining a doctor standing there calmly lowering dinner into a man's stomach like bait into a fishing hole. This is really cringe. It's gross. But Beaumont was methodical and patient and fascinated. And Alexis St Martin became the center of one of the most important medical studies in history. Now, this is where modern listeners sometimes imagine a respectful scientific partnership filled with mutual admiration and noble purpose. I am sorry to disappoint you. The truth was far more complicated. Alexis was not a wealthy volunteer lounging comfortably in some university laboratory and hanging out on a chaise lounge while he had food unceremoniously dropped into his stomach using a piece of string. He was a working man on the frontier with limited options and a permanent wound that made ordinary employment extremely difficult for him. So Beaumont hired him as a servant. Alexis chopped wood, he hauled supplies, he performed physical labor, and during pauses between experiments, he carried burdens and handled chores around the household. And the experiments themselves were not always pleasant. Sometimes Beaumont inserted tubes directly into the stomach opening to extract, let's call them the gastric juices. Other times he lowered cloth sacks filled with food inside Alexis to observe digestion more carefully. Beaumont even studied how emotions affected digestion, noting that anger or stress changed stomach activity. How are you making somebody angry or stressed out just for an experiment to see how it affects their digestion? This is barbaric. At one point, Alexis complained of pain and discomfort during the testing, which Beaumont recorded almost as casually as anything else in his notes. The detail says a lot. To Beaumont, the experiments were revolutionary scientific work. But to Alexis, they may have sometimes felt like being trapped inside the strangest job on earth. Painful experience, a humiliating experience. And then comes the part of the story that many quick summaries conveniently just skim right past. Alexis ran away. More than once. He returned to Canada at different points, apparently tired of the experiments and the arrangement altogether. Beaumont repeatedly tried to persuade him to return. In at least one instance, Alexis was reportedly brought back so Beaumont could continue his studies. He was brought back by force. That changes the tone of this story considerably, because suddenly this is not just a triumphant tale of medical discovery. It becomes morally tangled and messy and, yes, very human. Beaumont absolutely did advance science and human health. There's no denying that. But Alexis himself sometimes seems like a willing scientific collaborator, and sometimes more like a man whose survival accidentally turned him into a living medical property. And yet, without him, entire areas of digestive science might have remained mysteries for decades longer. That contradiction sits at the corner of the story like a stone nobody quite knows what to do with. And it's hanging around his neck like a millstone. Over roughly 10 years, Beaumont conducted an estimated 200 experiments on Alexis's stomach. That poor man. What he discovered changed medicine permanently. He proved digestion relied heavily on chemical processes rather than simple mechanical grinding. We don't have gizzards to help grind up our food. But he demonstrated that gastric juices contained hydrochloric acid. He observed how temperature affected digestion. He found that vegetables generally digested more slowly than meat. He learned that milk coagulated early during digestion, curdling in a way. Today, much of this sounds obvious because modern medicine absorbed these discoveries so completely that people rarely stop to think about where we learned this knowledge from and how did we come up with this information. But in the 1800s, this was groundbreaking work. It became even more groundbreaking for criminal investigations later on. And I hope that comes up here soon in a future episode. It's fascinating. Beaumont published his findings in 1833 under the lengthy title, see if I can get this right here, Experiments and Observations on the Gastric Juice and Physiology of Digestion. I did have it written down. Doctors across Europe and America paid attention. Medical science moved forward because one man survived an injury that should have killed him. That alone feels almost impossible. Meanwhile, Alexis tried to build some kind of a normal life. He married, he raised children. He worked when he could and returned to Canada, eventually permanently. And despite Beaumont's repeated invitations, we'll call them invitations in air quotes, he refused to resume the experiments. That refusal may tell us everything we truly need to know about how Alexis himself felt about the arrangement. William Beaumont eventually became celebrated as the father of gastric physiology. Medical schools studied his work. Physicians admired his careful observations. His reputation grew steadily after his publication. Then came the final strange chapter, when Alexis St Martin died in 1880. His family feared that doctors might attempt to steal or dissect this now famous stomach. Think about that for a second. Even after decades had passed, even after Alexis had spent years trying to live quietly, the wound still followed him. The medical curiosity still clung to his name. So his family delayed burial intentionally. They waited until decomposition had advanced enough that no ambitious physician would likely attempt an autopsy or to preserve his stomach for further research. That detail hangs over the whole story like a freezing cold fog, because it suggests the family understood something deeply uncomfortable about the whole thing. They feared the world valued the famous stomach more than the man attached to it. And maybe they were right. The strange thing is that history rarely fits neatly into categories like heroes and villains. William Beaumont was not some cackling mad scientist operating in a dungeon laboratory with his fingernails up in the air and, working away. He was an intelligent physician working within the limits and ethics of the time, genuinely trying to understand the human body and improve medicine in whatever ways he could. And Alexis St Martin was not merely a helpless victim either. He negotiated, he resisted, refused, returned, and ultimately, he did choose his own path away from Beaumont's experiments. Both men existed inside a complicated relationship that was shaped by survival, science, necessity, curiosity, and even power. The complexity is what makes this story endure, because beneath the medical discoveries and the frontier drama sits a question people still wrestle with today. How far should science go in pursuit of knowledge? Modern medicine still depends on experimentation, observation, and difficult ethical choices. Even some animal experimentation. Doctors save lives because earlier physicians pushed the boundaries and studied things other people feared or misunderstood. But stories like this remind us that scientific progress sometimes arrives really wrapped up in a whole lot of discomfort. The discoveries that help millions can begin in very deeply personal suffering. And perhaps the strangest part of all is that this entire chapter of medical history started with one accidental gunshot at a remote trading post on a summer day in 1822. One blast, one survivor, one wound that refused to close, and a hole in one man's stomach that changed medicine forever. So here's the question I want you to answer for me in the comments. It's a personal opinion thing, so let's not be attacking each other in the comments this time. If you had been Alexis St Martin, knowing your suffering could advance medical science for generations, would you have continued participating in Beaumont's experiments in spite of the pain and discomfort? Or would you have walked away for good the first chance you got? I'm torn on this one myself. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more of the deep dives into gastric juices of history's most fascinating moments. And subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Every subscriber helps. This one was kind of gross. Thanks for watching.